with delight, but I long to meet my Savior first of all. I shall know him, and redeemed by his side I shall stand. I shall know him, by the print of the nails in his hand. To the work, we are servants of God. Let us follow the path that our Master has trod. With the balm of his counsel our strength to renew, let us do with our might what our hands find to do. Toiling on.
If you would, open up to Genesis chapter 24. Genesis chapter 24. If you remember, we're not going to do much of a review tonight because really as this chapter progresses, you're going to get kind of a review on multiple occasions just because of the way the chapter unfolds. But at the very beginning of the chapter, it speaks of Abraham being blessed by God in every way, thinking in terms of physically, spiritually, in terms of promises from God and covenant, in terms of promises to his descendants, in terms of all these different aspects. And yet out of all these things together, there is one thing that is on the heart and the mind of Abraham. It is about he does not have a son who is married. And here is Isaac, roughly the age of 37 to 40. By the end of the chapter, he'll be married and he'll be 40 years old. But coming to this point in time, and he calls his oldest servant, who you assume has the longest relationship with him, and he says, I want you to make a promise to me, an oath, swear to me. He says, put your hand underneath my thigh as a solemn vow. And if you remember that promise, what were the things that he actually wanted the promise to be based upon? A couple of things within this promise. What were they?
That he would get a wife for Isaac out of his family.
Yeah, to go back to his relatives and to find a wife. And specifically, do not let him marry a Canaanite woman. And as it goes through those things specifically, you also notice he's also given, as the servant says, what if she doesn't want to come? And Abraham says, if that's what happens, then you're free from this oath. You don't have to drag her back. You don't have to do anything along those lines. And so the servant swears to him concerning this matter. And as well as that, then the servant sets out with 10 camels, goes to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor, which would be his great uncle in one sense. And then to go, now he's here. He's made this oath and this promise, and he prays to God while he's there. And in making this prayer, he prays to the covenant God, praising him for his loving kindness, which is covenant love. And now, here he finds himself in this situation, and who comes out there to the place of the well? A woman by the name of Rebekah. And how is she described? Very beautiful. And so you realize it's also very specific about that she has kept herself pure. She's a virgin. She's never known a man in that sense. And so everything starts to come together. If you remember, the servant's prayer request was, if I say to this woman, let your jar down for me to have a drink, if she says, I'll do that, I'll also pour water for your camels. And sure enough, here's Rebekah, and that's exactly the way she responds. And if you remember, she actually comes out before he even finishes his prayer. Then, as this continues, she draws for all of his camels until they are finished drinking. And while all these things are going on and unfolding so quickly, he just seems to be there, just setting his gaze on her in amazement. If you think of traveling over 450 miles to be there, and then things to come together so quickly, seemingly so easily. And so then, as a result of that, he gives her in verse 22, says, took a gold ring weighing a half shekel. Later on down, when we get further in the chapter, into verse 47, it's going to actually tell you that ring was put in her nose. You might be thinking when it said ring, you go, oh, that's probably a wedding. No, it's not. It's for her nose. When's the last time you saw a beautiful girl and said, you know what, let me give you a ring for your nose? Maybe we can make something of this for my master's son. But then, of course, 2 bracelets for her wrists. They're each would weigh about 2 ounces apiece, pretty good size. And we talked about on the present market, this would be a gift worth more than $12,000, which tells you this is not something insignificant. And I'm sure for her, she's like, you got any more camels you need watered? But that's not part of it, you know. Then, as it continues on, he asks a few questions. Verse 23, whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room for us to lodge in your father's house? She said to him, I'm the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. And of course, Nahor and Abraham are brothers. Then, verse 25, again she said to him, we have plenty of both straw and feed and room to lodge in. Verse 26, then the man bowed low and worshiped the Lord. And I want you to think in these terms. Here's things that have come together. You're going to a land that's 450 miles away. The first, you pray to God for him to intervene to keep these promises that have been given in terms of for Isaac to find a mate, for him to keep his promise to Abraham to find a wife of his relatives. And here it is, not only is she willing to give him water, she's willing to water all of his camels. There's 10 of them. And until they are done, finished drinking. And now to come to find out that this woman is actually a relative, a close relative, in terms of being related to Abraham. And so he bows low and he worships the Lord, the covenant God. And listen to what that worship sounds like. Because look at verse 27. He said, blessed be the Lord, the covenant God, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness. He has not turned away from his covenant love, his covenant responsibilities. He says, and his truth toward my master in the promises that he had given him. He says, as for me, the Lord, the covenant God, has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers. So is the servant aware that Nahor is a brother of Abraham? He certainly is. Because if you've been sent there to find a relative of your master, you better know who your master's relatives are, right? So, notice verse 28. I want you to kind of notice the terminology of run or ran. We've already seen it twice, which is kind of unique. Back in verse 17, as soon as the servant saw Rebekah, it says the servant ran to meet her. When you look down in verse 20 about the camels to be watered, it says, so she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all his camels. Now verse 28, as she hears this worship to God, she starts to understand a few things. Verse 28, then the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. Where does she go? I'm going to go tell my mother. We have relatives in town, or at least servant of relatives, and here they've come. So she runs to the household, tells her about these things, verse 29. Now Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran outside to the man at the spring. Well, these people run all over the place, don't they? Here's the real point. This is the first time you get introduced to Laban. Now, you've been introduced to Rebekah before, and back in chapter 22 at the very end. But now you find Laban gets introduced this way, and I want you to pay close attention to Laban. Just the way it talks about him, you'll see something, I think, very specific. And so as soon as Laban hears about this, now consider the thought, what did Laban hear about? The next verse is going to give it away. He says, so Laban runs outside to the man who's at the spring, and the servant's still at the spring. Verse 30. When he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's wrists, and when he heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, saying, this is what the man said to me, he went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. What caught Laban's attention? This is some pretty big gifts. And notice he sees that first. To see the ring in her nose, to see the bracelets that are on her wrists, and then to hear her say, this is who this man is and who he's from and who his master is, and he's come all the way down here. Now, if you notice, has the servant really said anything about his true purpose in being here yet? No. He hasn't gotten down to the details of, my master's son, we're looking for a wife who's related. Then he says, so here he is, he runs out there, and he went to the man, and of course, the servant's still standing by the camels at the spring. Verse 31. And he said, come in, blessed of the Lord, covenant God. Do you notice how they're using the same kind of terminology here? An understanding about who this God is. He says, he keeps his promises. He says, why do you stand outside since I have prepared the house and a place for the camels? You don't have to stay out here. Come on in. I don't know if you've ever had a family come to your house and you're so excited to see them and you just start talking out there, and eventually what do you say? Well, come on inside. We have things prepared. So here's Laban. Notice once again, Laban is rather focused on the physical, isn't he? Now, what do you know about the future with Laban? He going to have any daughters? He going to pull any stunts with them? Is he going to change the inheritance for the one who's working for his daughters? What does it seem like Laban's life is centered around? Wealth, money. Now, he's going to be very unhappy as you get through this story later on. Now, not in this moment, because he's excited. You mean we have a wealthy relative? Oh. Well, verse 32. Once again, I don't know how to take this one exactly, but I know the way I want to take it. So the man entered the house, then Laban unloaded the camels. Now, why would he want to unload the camels? Just a nice guy? Do you kind of get a little overtone there of, well, let's see what else is in here? I kind of feel that way, but I'm a little timid to actually know that with certainty. So I'll be careful with that one. So he unloaded the camels. He gave straw and feed to the camels and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. So, this servant is not there by himself. There's other men that are there with him. And so, once again, he's taking care of them, wash their feet, the feet of the men who were with him, verse 33. But when food was set before him to eat, he said, I will not eat until I have told my business. And he said, speak on. Now, you just consider this for a moment. He's been traveling for about 2 or 3 weeks to get here. And finally, you get here to a place, and they're so excited to have him, and they have food set down in front of him, and he's a servant, and he's being treated like what? Like royal family. And yet, I want you to see the heart of the servant. What's he concerned about now? I gave an oath. I gave my word. I'm not going to start eating and act like everything is already taken care of. He says, I can't eat until I tell you why I'm actually here. I want you to think about what that says about the servant. What does that say to you? Faithful? Dedicated in terms of devotion? Very loyal in these terms, and to think, I'm going to put what I promised to do ahead of self. Chuck?
I think he knows he's already probably on the right path here.
Right. Otherwise, just wasting time if this is not it. Then, verse 30, and notice Laban says, and he said, speak on. Okay, let's talk about this. Verse 34. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. So he makes this very clear, because now he's in the house, and you're going to find out there are other people who are there other than just Laban as this story unfolds. But here's another aspect I want you to be mindful of. As soon as this servant got to town, and he's out there at the well, he's praying to God. And he actually addresses it, the God of Abraham. He doesn't say my God. He says, the God of Abraham. He says, will you remember your covenant and show loving kindness? At this point, you see that that's what the servant is doing. Do you think Abraham is back in the homeland praying about these things too? Would you imagine that? I mean, it doesn't say. But in terms of sending him out, and he's already been gone now for 2 or 3 weeks, you think about for Abraham back in Beersheba, of going, this whole process is going to take 4 to 6 weeks. And there's not going to be a text message or a call home. He's just gone. Now, he says, I'm Abraham's servant. And I kind of wonder about what Abraham was doing during all this. But, verse 35, the Lord, the covenant God, has greatly blessed my master, so that he has become rich. And he has given him flocks and herds and silver and gold and servants and maids and camels and donkeys. How do you imagine old Laban's heart's doing right now? Oh, could this get any better? If he's really fleshly minded in terms of these things, I mean, he notices the jewelry first. Let me unpack the camels. He already kind of has a feel for this. And then all of a sudden he says, you know, my master, he says, he's rich. And then lists these things off, flocks, herds, silver and gold. And by the way, Laban's already aware of the gold. He's already aware of, there's some garments that are going to be shared later on in this story. He knows what's there. I mean, he already knows about the camels. He's already seen the 10 of them. And so, and there's donkeys and maids and servants, and some of those servants are there alongside of this main servant. Verse 36. Now Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master in her old age, and she has given him all that he has, and he has given him all that he has. And if you notice, he doesn't go out of his way to say, I mean, she was really old. He doesn't go into all those details. But here's kind of the point. And if you also realize, where's Sarah at this point? She passed away, right? She passed away a good 10 years before this, or so. Sorry, not 10 years, just a couple years. Then, notice how it continues. He says, he's given him all that he has. Verse 37, my master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I live. But you shall go to my father's house and to my relatives and take a wife for my son. At this point, what is starting to be unveiled? Why is he here? My master, Abraham, has a son, and we're looking for a wife. And I swore to my master that I would come here to find this wife. And he continues on, and he even tells him the exception to this oath, to this swearing. Because in verse 39, he says, 38, but you shall go to my father's house and to my relatives and take a wife for my son. I said to my master, suppose the woman does not follow me. What if she doesn't want to come? And you think in terms of this, of saying, if you're listening to this, what do you hear in that? You know, you've come to find a relative. What if she doesn't want to come? What do they already know now? There's a choice. You don't have to worry about us stealing one of your daughters or relatives. Then, continues on verse 40. And he said to me, the Lord, the covenant God, before whom I have walked, will send his angel with you to make your journey successful. And you will take a wife for my son, from my relatives, and from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my relatives. If they do not give her to you, you will be free from my oath. What was Abraham so confident about? God was going to work this out. The Lord, covenant God, was going to find a way for this to work. He says he's going to send his angel, and when he does, something is going to open up. And then the idea of, but if it doesn't, if you're not willing, we're going to do something different. Then, notice how it continues on. Verse 42. Now he starts to recount the story that we already read last week. And I want you to realize how much detail he gives in this so that they understand. And I want you to kind of take this from that mindset of, if you have ever prayed about something in a very specific way, and I want you to remember, sometimes people take this servant's prayer and kind of look at it as a blueprint for how we're supposed to be before God, of like, if you want me to take this job, then, have a big storm that tears down this tree or something, whatever. Understand, this servant was already on a mission. And while he's on the mission, he's asking for God's help. He is not out here saying, this is what I want to happen. Show it to me if you want this to happen too. It's not that kind of thing. Don't try and superimpose that kind of thinking on the story. So here he is, and now he's going to share with them what happened to him. In the same way that whenever you've prayed for something and things have come together in a way that is just according to how you prayed, it's one thing to you because you know what you said, you know the events as they have taken place up to that point, and you know the conviction that you've drawn because of it. It's a lot different when you tell that to somebody else, isn't it? They might not have the same conviction. They might not draw the same conclusion. And so the servant, while the food's getting cold, all of a sudden, verse 42. So I came today to the spring and said, O Lord, O covenant God, the God of my master Abraham. And you almost feel like you're reading verses 12 through 14 again. He says, if now you will make my journey on which I go successful, behold, I am standing by the spring, and may it be that the maiden who comes out to draw, and to whom I say, please let me drink a little water from your jar, and she will say to me, you drink, and I will draw for your camels also. Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. If Rebecca is sitting at this meal, what's going through her head? What does she already know? I did that. You asked me for a drink, and I gave you a drink, and I voluntarily offered to water your camels. And this is what you prayed for? Don't you think that'd have an effect on you? Now, look at how this continues. Verse 45. Before I had finished speaking in my heart, which tells you where this worship was taking place, right? Where this prayer was taking place. Doesn't say worship back there, but prayer. He says, before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder and went down to the spring and drew. And I said to her, please let me drink. She quickly lowered her jar from her shoulder. What do you think it includes as quickly? Didn't even hesitate. He says, she quickly lowered her jar from her shoulder and said, drink, and I will water your camels also. So I drank, and she watered the camels also. I mean, just like, it just unfolding right in front of me. And you can imagine him telling this story. I mean, it happened the same day. And I hope you've had that kind of experience where there's something that you're kind of unsure about how things are gonna go, and you pray about it in a specific way, and all of a sudden things just start to, it's like tumblers in a lock. They just kind of all start to hit in the right place, and all of a sudden everything's just kind of unfolding before your eyes. And whenever it comes to its adequate place, you go, I want to tell somebody about this. And now he is, and he's unfolding these things. Verse 47. Then I asked her and said, whose daughter are you? And she said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, who Milcah bore to him. And I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her wrist. Now, what had Laban already seen? He had already noticed the extra jewelry that his sister Rebekah had, right? Verse 48. And I bowed low and worshiped the Lord. He says, it brought within me a worship to the covenant God. Because what is this servant seeing happen right before his eyes? What is God keeping? Keeping his promise, answering his prayer, the loving kindness of God right here in front of us. There's something in terms of whenever you know God has made a promise to you, and you have prayed to him concerning this promise that he's made, and then to watch it happen right in front of you, you realize this is not a coincidence. This is God keeping his promise. If you've ever had a moment, I so often think in terms of Matthew 6 about you seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and he'll take care of the physical things. You come to that spot in life where the physical things aren't coming together, and then you pray to God, remembering that promise. And you have to ask yourself, am I really keeping his kingdom first? Am I really responding out of what's righteous? And then maybe you realize, you know what, I have to make a move here. I have to change. I'm not responding in a way that's righteous. I'm really not putting his kingdom first. And then you humble yourself to do that, and then all of a sudden, the physical thing works out. And what do you gain? Do you gain conviction in the promises of God? If I'll respond to honor God in this covenant that we have through Christ, God's going to keep his promises. And it just makes your faith get encouraged. And you go, what else can I entrust to God? Chuck.
I think it's interesting that Isaac and Rebekah both are they're not initiating any of this stuff to make this happen, but they're certainly end up being a big part of how all this comes together.
Right. Here's Isaac, who's 450 miles away, and here's Rebekah, here in the land of her fathers in Mesopotamia.
But the promise was given to Abraham, so it's his faith that's
Responding to send this servant up here to the city of Nahor. So you notice how this continues. I bowed low and worshiped the Lord and blessed the Lord. How can I say anything but good things about a covenant God who keeps his promises? There's something we should think about. He says, the God of my master Abraham, who had guided me in the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. So now if you're going to deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me. And if not, let me know that I may turn to the right hand or the left. Are you going to give Rebekah to my master's son? Deal kindly with me, but if not, just tell me. And then I'm going to go looking for somebody else here. Notice he doesn't say, and then I'm going to go home because I tried. He says, I'll know whether to go left or right. Verse 50. Then Laban and Bethuel replied. Now, Laban, of course, the son, Bethuel, the father. Bethuel is also the father of Rebekah. And to go, this is a brother and a father who's sitting down at this meal so far, along with the servant of Abraham. He says, the matter comes from the Lord, so we cannot speak to you bad or good. He says, this is in the Lord's hands. Isn't that something? How many times people want to walk up to you and say, hey, what's your opinion on this? How many times should we be like, I don't have an opinion. This is the Lord's work. This is his will. This is what he desires. I'm amazed sometimes at people will ask. Sometimes we have visitors who come in to our assembly, and they'll say, now, what do you think about this? I go, it doesn't matter what I think. I said, well, let's look at these scriptures. And you open them up, and I said, now read these and tell me, how does that answer your question? And you realize, for Laban and Bethuel here, you can see the servant saying, you tell me whether this is it or not. And they say, it's not for us to say. Specifically, the matter comes from the Lord, so we cannot speak to you bad or good. He says, this is what the covenant God has done and brought together. Then, verse 51, here is Rebekah before you, which tells you, guess who else is sitting at the table? Rebekah's here too. He says, take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord, the covenant God, has spoken. Boy, I bet that was something for Rebekah. Here she is just drawing water for a servant's camels and giving him a drink, and then all of a sudden everybody's staying there with their animals, and they're sitting down for a meal, and all of a sudden, I guess I'm going. Which also be reminded that these are not American love stories. These are arranged marriages. And that's what you're seeing unfold in front of you. Verse 52. When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the ground before the Lord. What is he wanting to do? Look at everything that has come together. To travel all this distance to be in Mesopotamia, the city of Nahor, the first young woman that you encounter is a woman who is a relative of your master, even though you don't know it yet. It turns out she's a pure woman. It turns out she's a servant, because whenever he asks for a drink, she's willing to water all the camels. She is willing to invite you and your clan into her home for the night and to be fed. And you're even given a gift. And then to sit down and to learn what this servant had been praying about before you ever came out to draw water. And that he couldn't even finish his prayer before you got there. What an unveiling. So here's Rebekah. Abraham's servant hears these words, bows himself to the ground before the Lord. Verse 53, the servant brought out articles of silver and articles of gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah. I'm sure Laban knew exactly where they were, because he's the one who unpacked the camels. And yet, you see what happens here. He also gave precious things to her brother and to her mother. Guess who else receives some of these things? Laban does, and her mother, who's never mentioned by name. And so, then verse 54, then he and the men who were with him ate and drank and spent the night. What are they willing to do now? Let's eat. God's promises have been discovered, and who's going to be married to my master's son Isaac has been unveiled and revealed, and you're willing, and she's willing. Fantastic. Then, let's eat. It says, and they ate and they drank and they spent the night. When they arose in the morning, he said, send me away to my master. I want you to notice the heart of this servant. He doesn't say, all right, we'll just leave. What does he do? He asks. He appeals. Then, look at the first response. Verse 55. But her brother and her mother said, let the girl stay with us a few days, say 10. Afterwards she may go. Well, you know, we're all in on Rebekah being married to your master's son, but you don't have to go so quick. How about 10 days? Now remember, this servant's been away from his master for 2 or 3 weeks already, and it's going to take just as long to get back down to Beersheba. I don't know if you've ever had this thought when somebody says, hey, why don't you stay and eat another meal and share this time when you're thinking, you know, I could be halfway home by the time we get done with this meal. Here he is, and notice his appeal, verse 56. He said to them, do not delay me. Since the covenant God has prospered my way, send me away that I may go to my master. Because remember, what had he made to his master? He gave his oath. He gave his promise. which also tells us a little something about keeping promises. Sometimes we get a little slack in that area of going, I said I'd do that, but things came up. Well, if it's important, it'll be important. I want you to realize this servant sees it as important. He doesn't say, well, it'd be okay to just wait another 10 days, I guess. Then, once again, you see the heart of the servant. He says, send me away that I may go to my master, verse 57. And they said, we will call the girl and consult her wishes. Let's ask Rebekah what she thinks. Isn't that something? They didn't treat her like, well, who cares? I want you to see this, that they show honor to her. Laban showing honor to his sister, Bethuel and mother showing honor. Then, verse 58, then they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. She's ready. Can you only imagine about her? I mean, we're about ready to go on what I'm going to assume is probably the longest trip of her life. 450 miles away. I know the distance. I don't know whether it's really the longest one, but the way things are going, she stayed pretty close to home. She's never been with another man, so you know she hasn't run away in that fashion. She says, I will go. Verse 59. Thus they sent away their sister, and interesting it says their, not just his, but their sister Rebekah and her nurse. Now, it won't be till you get over to Genesis 35, verse 8, that you find out the name of her nurse is Deborah. And it's just going to give it to you once. But right back here, it says, they sent their sister Rebekah and her nurse with Abraham's servants and his men. Abraham's servant and his men. And as this, notice what they do. Here she's leaving town today. We were hoping for 10 more days, but she's leaving today. Verse 60. They blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them. Now they asked this blessing, thousands of 10,000s. How many children is Rebekah going to have? 2. Now, the descendants are going to be thousands upon millions upon, you get the idea. He says, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them. May God grant you victory as you go in whatever may come. Verse 61. Then Rebekah arose with her maids, and notice it says maids plural. So there's the nurse, Deborah, and there's maids plural. So she has a little group that's going with her. She's not going by herself. It says, and they mounted the camels. It's kind of something. There's 10 of them. He says, and followed the man. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't call him the servant anymore. That calls him the man. He says, so the servant took Rebekah and departed. And here they go. And you think, once again, when you get to verse 62, 450 miles has gone by. I mean, it's been 2 or 3 weeks again. And so you realize this is quite a journey through chapter 24. Verse 62. Now Isaac had come from going to Beer-lahai-roi. And you might remember this city because this is the same place where, if you remember, where Hagar and Ishmael had run away. And this is where she had prayed that she not have to watch her son die, not knowing that her son's going to have 12 more sons, and this family's going to get pretty big pretty quick with Ishmael. But here in her limited place, and so you realize the name Beer-lahai-roi is about God hears. Isn't this something? All this happens. Isaac has come from going to God hears, for he was living in the Negev, the southern portion. Verse 63. Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, camels were coming. And he goes out there just to meditate, to think about these things. Now, I'm going to make an assumption here that he already knew that Abraham had sent this servant. What's going to come of this? Can you imagine if you had an arranged marriage with somebody you had never met? Might you want to do some meditating on that? Yeah, it took some meditating with sometimes with people that you knew, right? Then, real quickly, let's finish up. He says, Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, camels were coming. Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel. She did get a ride. Verse 65. She said to the servant, who is that man walking in the field to meet us? And the servant said, he is my master. Then she took her veil and covered herself. She covers herself over. There's going to be an unveiling here in a little bit. Verse 66. The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Can you imagine how long it took him to get through all of chapter 24? And here she is standing there. Travel all this way and still have to wait. Verse 67. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that is agape love. He was willing to sacrifice for her. What a beautiful picture. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death, and his mother had been dead for 3 years. And you realize those things together. And so you kind of see how these things come together. I wish we'd had more time to really look a little bit more deeply at these things. But you see how God keeps his covenant promise. It doesn't always go in the easiest fashion, but he always keeps his promise. All right. We're willing to come back next week. Chapter 25.
That shadows a dry, thirsty land. He hideth my life in the depths of his love, and covers me there with his hand, and covers me there with his hand. When clothed in his brightness, transported I rise to meet him in clouds of the sky. His perfect salvation, his wonderful love, I'll shout with the millions on high. He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock, that shadows a dry, thirsty land. He hideth my life in the depths of his love, and covers me there with his hand, and covers me there with his hand. When my life work is ended and I cross the swelling tide, when the bright and glorious morning I shall see, I shall know my Redeemer when I reach the other side, and his smile will be the first to welcome me.